April 4th, 1945. The 89th Infantry Division of the United States Army advances through the German countryside near the town of Ohrdruf, a subcamp of Buchenwald. The men have been fighting across Europe for months. They've seen combat, death, and destruction. They consider themselves hardened soldiers who've witnessed the worst of war. They have no idea what they're about to find. As they approach the camp perimeter, they notice the smell first, a stench so overwhelming that soldiers cover their faces. Some vomit. The smell of death, decay, and human waste is unlike anything they've encountered, even on battlefields. Then they see the bodies, stacked like cordwood, piled in ditches, scattered across the grounds, emaciated corpses, skin stretched over bone, faces frozen in agony. And then they see the survivors. Living skeletons, barely able to stand, staring at the Americans with hollow eyes. Some try to smile, some try to speak. Many simply weep. Private First Class James Hoyt of the 89th Division later wrote, "We had heard rumors, stories about camps, about atrocities, but nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared us for what we saw. I looked at these people and couldn't understand how they were alive. I couldn't understand how human beings could do this to other human beings." The liberation of Nazi concentration camps by American forces in 1945 represents one of the most profound and traumatic experiences in military history. The soldiers who discovered these camps were confronted with evil on a scale they couldn't comprehend. What they witnessed changed them forever. This is their story. The story of what happened when American soldiers discovered the concentration camps. The story of liberation, of horror, of humanity confronting the unthinkable. This is what they saw. This is what they did. This is how it changed them. To understand the liberation of the camps, we need to understand the context of the American advance into Germany in early 1945. The military situation. By March 1945, Allied forces were deep inside Germany. The Rhine had been crossed. German resistance, though still fierce in places, was collapsing. The end of the war was in sight. American forces advancing from the west encountered hundreds of thousands of German prisoners, displaced persons, and refugees. The infrastructure of Nazi Germany was disintegrating. Roads were clogged with civilians fleeing the fighting. But the American soldiers advancing through Germany in spring 1945 had a limited understanding of what the Nazi regime had done. They knew the Nazis were evil. Propaganda and reports had made that clear. They knew about persecution of Jews and other groups, but the scale and systematic nature of the Holocaust wasn't fully understood. What soldiers knew. Most American soldiers had heard vague reports about concentration camps. Some had seen propaganda films or read newspaper articles about Nazi atrocities. But these reports were often dismissed as exaggeration or war propaganda. Sergeant Robert Persinger of the 4th Armored Division later recalled, "We'd heard stories about camps where political prisoners were held. We thought they'd be like POW camps, maybe worse. Nobody told us we were going to find death factories. Nobody prepared us for what we actually saw." The term concentration camp existed, but its meaning wasn't fully understood. Many soldiers thought these were political prisons or labor camps, harsh, but not fundamentally different from what they might expect in wartime. The term extermination camp didn't exist in common usage. The phrase death camp wasn't widely known. The systematic genocide, the industrial murder of millions, wasn't something the average American soldier comprehended. Soviet discoveries. The Soviet Red Army, advancing from the east, had already liberated several major camps. Majdanek in July 1944, Auschwitz in January 1945. Soviet reports described horrific conditions and evidence of mass murder. but Soviet reports were often viewed with suspicion in the West. There was concern that Soviet propaganda might be exaggerating Nazi crimes for political purposes. The full truth of Soviet discoveries hadn't penetrated American military consciousness. So, American soldiers advancing through Germany in April 1945 were largely unprepared for what they were about to encounter. The first discoveries. Ohrdruf, discovered on April 4, 1945, was the first Nazi camp liberated by American forces. It was a relatively small subcamp of Buchenwald, holding about 11,000 prisoners at its peak, used primarily for forced labor. When the 4th Armored Division and 89th Infantry Division entered Ohrdruf, they found approximately 3,200 corpses. The SS had massacred prisoners and attempted to destroy evidence before fleeing. Survivors, those too weak to be evacuated on death marches, numbered in the hundreds. The scene was apocalyptic. Bodies were everywhere, in barracks, in ditches, piled for burning. Many showed signs of violence, bullet wounds, crushed skulls. Others had simply starved to death or died of disease. The soldiers who entered first were stunned into silence, then rage, then profound confusion about what they were witnessing. Command response. News of Ohrdruf reached Supreme Headquarters immediately. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in Europe, decided he needed to see it himself. On April 12, 1945, Eisenhower visited Ohrdruf, accompanied by Generals Omar Bradley and George Patton. This visit would prove crucial in how the American military and ultimately the American public understood the camps. Eisenhower walked through the camp, viewing the bodies, speaking with survivors, and observing the evidence of systematic cruelty. Patton, known for his toughness, became physically ill and had to step away. Eisenhower later wrote to General George Marshall, "The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were so overpowering as to leave me a bit sick." In one room, where they were piled up 20 or 30 naked men killed by starvation, George Patton would not even enter. He said that he would get sick if he did so. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give first-hand evidence of these things, if ever, in the future, there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda. This last sentence is crucial. Eisenhower immediately understood that what he was seeing was so extreme that people in the future might not believe it. He insisted that the camps be documented extensively, that soldiers tour them to be witnesses, and that German civilians from nearby towns be brought to see what had been done in their name. Buchenwald. On April 11, 1945, just 1 week after Ohrdruf, American forces liberated Buchenwald, one of the largest concentration camps in Germany, located near Weimar. Buchenwald had held over 280,000 prisoners during its operation. When American forces arrived, approximately 21,000 prisoners remained, many near death from starvation and disease. An estimated 56,000 had died at Buchenwald over the years. The 6th Armored Division entered Buchenwald to find scenes that defied comprehension. Warehouses filled with prisoners' belongings, rooms stacked with corpses, survivors so emaciated they appeared skeletal, and evidence of medical experiments and systematic torture. Private First Class. Harry Herder described his first moments entering Buchenwald. "We went through the gates, and the first thing I saw was a pile of bodies, maybe 50 or 60 people. They were so thin you could see every bone. Their eyes were sunken. Some still had their mouths open like they'd been screaming. I thought they were mannequins. I couldn't process that they were real people. Then we saw people moving, survivors. They looked like the corpses, except they were standing up. I couldn't tell the living from the dead." Dachau. On April 29, 1945, the 45th Infantry Division and units of the 42nd Infantry Division liberated Dachau near Munich. Dachau was one of the first Nazi concentration camps, opened in 1933, and had become a symbol of Nazi terror. When American forces arrived, they found approximately 32,000 prisoners in the main camp and thousands more in subcamps. They also found over 2,000 corpses in railway cars outside the camp, prisoners who had been transported from other camps as the Nazis retreated, then left to die. The discovery of the death train at Dachau particularly enraged American soldiers. The boxcars were filled with bodies of prisoners who had starved or suffocated during transport. The sight triggered immediate rage and, in some cases, violent retribution against SS guards. Subsequent liberations. Throughout April and early May 1945, American forces continued discovering camps. Nordhausen, April 11th. A subcamp where V-2 rockets were manufactured using slave labor. Over 3,000 corpses found. Mauthausen, May 5. Austrian camp known for extreme brutality. About 20,000 prisoners liberated. Dozens of smaller subcamps and labor camps across Germany and Austria. Each discovery reinforced the pattern. Mass death, systematic cruelty, survivors on the brink of death, and evidence of crimes beyond normal warfare. The first hours after American soldiers entered the camps followed a pattern, though each camp had unique horrors. The senses. The smell hit soldiers before they saw anything. Veterans described it as unlike any other smell, a combination of death, human waste, disease, and burning flesh. The smell clung to clothing and remained in soldiers' memories for life. Sergeant Regine Ferris of the 42nd Division, who entered Dachau, later said, "The smell is what I remember first. It was so strong you could taste it." 50 years later, "Sometimes I'll smell something that triggers that memory, and I'm right back there. It's a smell you can never forget or describe adequately." The sounds were equally disturbing. Moaning from the dying, crying, occasional screams, and sometimes eerie silence from those too weak to make noise. Visually, the scenes were beyond comprehension. Soldiers described trying to process what they were seeing, their minds refusing to accept it as real. The corpses. The number of dead bodies was overwhelming. At some camps, thousands of corpses were piled in various locations, stacked in warehouses like lumber, piled in open pits, scattered across the grounds where people had collapsed, in barracks where the living and dead lay together, in railway cars at camps like Dachau. The condition of the bodies shocked soldiers. Most victims had starved to death, their bodies reduced to skin and bone. Soldiers described corpses that seemed to weigh nothing, with every rib visible, limbs like sticks, and faces that barely looked human. Private John Lee Archer, who entered Buchenwald, wrote in his diary, "I saw a pile of bodies and counted over 100. They were naked. You could see every bone. They looked like ancient Egyptian mummies, just skin stretched over skeleton. Their eyes were sunken deep in their skulls. I couldn't believe these had been living people just days ago." The survivors. If the dead were horrifying, the living were perhaps more disturbing because soldiers had to confront that these skeletal figures were human beings who were somehow still alive. Survivors weighed 70 to 90 pounds as adults. They could barely walk. Their eyes were sunken. Their skin was discolored and diseased. Many had open sores, lice infestations, and severe dysentery. When American soldiers approached, survivors reacted in different ways. Some rushed forward, trying to embrace their liberators, kissing their hands and uniforms, crying and laughing simultaneously. Others were too weak to react and simply stared, unable to process that they were being rescued. Some were so traumatized they cowered in fear, unable to believe the Americans were truly liberators and not new tormentors. Still others died in the first hours and days after liberation, their bodies too damaged to survive even after rescue. Captain Luther Fletcher of the 45th Division described the survivors at Dachau. "They came toward us like ghosts. They could barely walk. Some crawled. They reached out to touch us, to make sure we were real. They tried to smile, but their faces were so emaciated it looked like skulls grinning. One man grabbed my hand and kissed it, crying. He kept saying something in a language I didn't understand. He collapsed while holding my hand. I think he died right there, just after being liberated. He held on just long enough to see us arrive." Immediate actions. American soldiers, despite their shock, immediately began trying to help. Medical care. Medics were called in, but the medical needs were overwhelming. Thousands required immediate care. Many were beyond help, too far gone from starvation and disease. Medical personnel worked frantically, but often futilely. Food. Soldiers' natural instinct was to feed the starving prisoners. They offered their own rations: chocolate, bread, canned food. This kindness sometimes had tragic consequences. Prisoners who hadn't eaten substantial food in months couldn't digest it. Their systems, adapted to starvation, shut down when given rich food. Some died from eating. Doctors quickly learned they had to feed survivors very gradually, starting with thin soups and slowly introducing more substantial food. But in the first hours, before this was understood, some prisoners died from the food meant to save them. Water. Clean water was provided. Prisoners drank desperately. Some drank so much they became sick. Providing water safely to thousands of desperately thirsty people was a logistics challenge. Sanitation. The camps were cesspools of disease. Latrines overflowed. Barracks were filthy. Lice and disease were everywhere. Soldiers began organizing cleanup, though the scale was overwhelming. Security. Some camps still had SS guards when Americans arrived. These guards were immediately captured. In some cases, particularly at Dachau, American soldiers and liberated prisoners killed SS guards in acts of immediate retribution. While understandable, these killings later became controversial. The psychological effect on American soldiers was immediate and profound. Many became physically ill. Vomiting was common. Even hardened combat veterans found themselves unable to control their physical reaction to what they saw. Some became enraged. There are documented cases of American soldiers beating or killing SS guards in rage after seeing what had been done. Some shot guards on sight. Others allowed liberated prisoners to exact revenge. Some shut down emotionally, becoming quiet and withdrawn. The horror was too great to process in the moment. Many cried. Combat soldiers who hadn't cried, seeing their friends die in battle, wept at the concentration camps. The suffering was so extreme and so deliberate that it broke through the emotional armor soldiers had built. Private Harold Porter of the 89th Division later testified, "I'd been in combat for months. I'd seen men killed, seen terrible wounds, seen dead bodies. I thought I was tough. But walking into that camp broke me. I sat down on the ground and cried like a child. I couldn't stop crying. I cried for hours. Everything I'd thought about human nature, about civilization, about decency, it was all shattered." The first days and weeks after liberation were chaotic, as American forces tried to provide care for thousands of desperate survivors. Medical crisis. The medical situation was catastrophic. Doctors faced conditions they'd never trained for, and diseases they'd only read about in textbooks. Starvation. Most survivors suffered from severe malnutrition. Their bodies had consumed their own muscle and organ tissue to survive. Refeeding had to be done carefully. Doctors developed protocols, but many died despite treatment. too far gone to recover. Disease, typhus, tuberculosis, dysentery, and other diseases were rampant. The camps were breeding grounds for epidemic disease. Medical personnel had to treat thousands while preventing disease from spreading. Psychological trauma. Survivors exhibited severe psychological trauma. Some were catatonic. Others had violent outbursts. Many couldn't sleep, had nightmares, or showed signs of what we'd now call PTSD. The psychological dimension was overwhelming and poorly understood at the time. Captain Harold Fallick, a military doctor at Buchenwald, described his experience. "I'd been a doctor for 10 years. I thought I'd seen everything, but I walked into that camp hospital and couldn't process what I was seeing. People who weighed 70 pounds, adults who looked like children because of starvation, diseases I'd only seen pictures of, and the scale, thousands needed treatment immediately. We worked 20-hour days and still couldn't save them all. People died despite our best efforts. Their bodies were too damaged." Feeding the survivors. As mentioned, feeding starved prisoners was dangerous. The condition called refeeding syndrome occurs when severely malnourished people are given food too quickly. The body, adapted to starvation, can't handle the sudden influx of nutrients. Heart failure, respiratory failure, and other complications can result. American military medical personnel learned this through tragic trial and error in the first days of liberation. Initial attempts to feed survivors normally resulted in deaths. Doctors developed careful feeding protocols. Start with clear liquids and thin soups. Gradually introduce proteins. Monitor carefully for complications. Restrict quantities, even as patients begged for more food. This created agonizing situations where starving people begged for food and had to be refused for their own safety. Some survivors, finally free and seeing food, couldn't understand why they couldn't eat. Some became angry or despondent. Private Robert Hilliard described feeding survivors at Nordhausen. "They were so hungry. They begged us for food. One man grabbed a chocolate bar from my pocket and ate it before I could stop him. He died 2 hours later. His body couldn't handle it. After that, we were under strict orders about feeding. But how do you tell a starving man he can't eat? How do you take food away from someone who's been starved for years?" It felt cruel even though we were trying to save them. Shelter and sanitation. The camps themselves were death traps, diseased, filthy, and psychologically traumatic. But liberators faced immediate practical problems. Survivors had nowhere else to go, and moving thousands of critically ill people was impossible. Solutions varied by camp. Some camps were cleaned and kept operational temporarily as survivors recovered. Some survivors were moved to nearby towns, taking over German houses, often to the German civilians' horror and resentment. Field hospitals were established using military tents and equipment. German civilians were conscripted to help with cleanup, burial of the dead, and basic maintenance. Burying the dead, thousands of corpses needed burial. The scale was overwhelming, and the bodies continued to pile up as liberated prisoners died in the days after liberation. American forces organized mass burials. Bulldozers dug mass graves. Corpses were placed in these graves by the hundreds. German civilians from nearby towns were forced to participate. The decision to force German civilians to help bury the dead and to tour the camps was deliberate. Eisenhower and other commanders wanted Germans to confront what had been done in their name. German civilians often claimed ignorance. We didn't know. We heard rumors but didn't believe them. We thought they were just labor camps. American soldiers were enraged by these claims. How could you live near a camp that smelled of death and not know? How could you see trainloads of prisoners arriving and never returning and not suspect? Forcing civilians to view the camps and bury the dead was both practical, the work needed to be done, and psychological, confronting Germans with evidence of Nazi crimes. Many German civilians were genuinely shocked. Some claimed disbelief. Others admitted they'd suspected, but had been afraid to ask questions or act. A few were defiant. Lieutenant Colonel Walter J. Fellens, who oversaw civilian labor at camps, reported, "We brought townspeople through the camps. Some cried, some looked away. Some tried to claim it was Allied propaganda, that we'd killed these people ourselves. We made them touch the bodies, made them see the gas chambers and crematoria. Some still refused to believe. The capacity for denial is remarkable." Documenting the evidence. Following Eisenhower's directive, extensive documentation of the camps began immediately. Photography. Military photographers took thousands of photographs. These images would become some of the most powerful evidence of Nazi crimes. Film. Army Signal Corps filmed extensive footage at each camp, showing corpses, survivors, camp infrastructure, and German civilians confronting the evidence. Written reports. Detailed reports were compiled describing conditions, estimating numbers of dead, documenting evidence of murder, and recording survivor testimony. Preservation of evidence. Physical evidence was collected. Documents, instruments of torture, canisters of Zyklon B, and other materials that would later be used in war crimes trials. This documentation served multiple purposes, creating evidence for future war crimes, trials, informing the American public and world about Nazi atrocities, creating historical record that couldn't be denied or dismissed as propaganda. Educating soldiers about what they were fighting against. Testimony collection. Survivors who were well enough to speak gave testimony about their experiences. American personnel recorded these accounts. Stories of selection upon arrival at camps, descriptions of daily life, starvation, disease, and death. Accounts of medical experiments, torture, and execution. Names of SS personnel who had committed specific crimes. Information about the camp system and its operations. This testimony was often given in multiple languages through interpreters. Survivors were eager to tell their stories, desperate that the world know what had happened. But taking testimony from traumatized, starving survivors was challenging. Some couldn't speak coherently. Some broke down emotionally. Some told fragmented stories that were hard to piece together. When American forces liberated camps, they encountered not just victims, but perpetrators. SS guards. Most SS guards fled before liberators arrived, but some were captured. At Ohrdruf, few SS remained. Most had evacuated or executed prisoners and fled. At Buchenwald, some SS were captured during liberation. Prisoners identified particularly cruel guards. At Dachau, approximately 50-75 SS guards were killed immediately after liberation, shot by American soldiers, or killed by liberated prisoners in acts of immediate justice for revenge. At Mauthausen, SS guards surrendered to American forces, some trying to disguise themselves as prisoners. American soldiers' reactions to captured SS guards ranged from immediate execution to arrest for war crimes trials. The Dachau reprisals. The most documented case of American soldiers killing SS guards occurred at Dachau. Upon discovering the death train with over 2,000 corpses and entering the camp, American soldiers of the 45th Infantry Division were overcome with rage. Accounts vary, but it's clear that American soldiers executed dozens of SS guards after they surrendered. Some were lined up against a wall and shot. Others were killed by liberated prisoners while American soldiers looked on. Private John Lee of the 45th Division later testified, "We found those train cars full of dead bodies, people who'd been left to starve and suffocate. Then we went into the camp and saw what the SS had done. When we captured guards, I didn't see them as prisoners. I saw them as murderers who deserved to die. Some of our guys lined them up and shot them. I didn't stop it. I didn't participate. But I didn't stop it. I felt they deserved what they got. These killings later became controversial. Officially, they violated rules of war regarding treatment of prisoners. Investigations were conducted, but ultimately no American soldiers were prosecuted for killing SS guards at Dachau. The prevailing view was that, while technically illegal, the actions were understandable given what the soldiers had witnessed. Kapos, the prisoner functionaries. Kapos were prisoners who'd been given authority over other prisoners. The SS used Kapos to maintain order, reducing the need for SS personnel to directly manage daily camp operations. Some Kapos used their positions to help fellow prisoners, sharing food, warning of selections, sabotaging SS orders when possible. These Kapos were often lauded by survivors. But other Kapos had been brutal, using their power to abuse and even kill fellow prisoners. These Kapos often collaborated actively with the SS, becoming de facto perpetrators themselves. When camps were liberated, identifying Kapos was complex. Good Kapos. Survivors defended Kapos who'd helped them, explaining that these individuals had made impossible choices to save lives when possible. Bad Kapos. Survivors pointed out Kapos who'd been cruel. Some of these Kapos were beaten or killed by newly liberated prisoners. Others were arrested by American forces. Gray areas. Many Kapos fell into gray areas. They'd sometimes helped, sometimes hurt prisoners, navigating impossible moral situations under Nazi terror. American soldiers struggled with how to handle Kapos. Were they victims who'd been forced into impossible positions? Or were they collaborators who deserved punishment? Different commanders made different decisions. Lieutenant Samuel Friedman, who spoke Yiddish and interviewed survivors, described the Kapo problem. Survivors would point out Kapos and say, "He killed people," or "He stole food from the dying." But then others would say, "He had no choice," or "He saved my life once." How do you judge someone who was put in a position where any choice meant someone might die? We tried to distinguish between Kapos, who'd tried to help, and Kapos, who'd been genuinely sadistic. But it wasn't always clear. German civilians' role. Beyond the SS, questions arose about civilian complicity. The towns near camps, towns near concentration camps claimed ignorance. We didn't know what was happening. American soldiers found this implausible. The camps smelled, employed local labor, and were visible from surrounding areas. Factory owners. Many concentration camp prisoners were used as slave labor in factories. Factory owners and managers had directly witnessed prisoner conditions. They were complicit in the exploitation and often in deaths. Railway workers. Transporting millions of prisoners to camps required railway infrastructure. Railway workers had seen cattle cars packed with people. They knew these people weren't returning. Bureaucrats. The logistics of running camps required paperwork, supply chains, and administration involving thousands of civilians. American forces conducted investigations into civilian complicity. Some civilians were charged with war crimes. Others were required to perform labor related to camp cleanup and burial of the dead. The extent of civilian knowledge and responsibility remained contested. Some Germans genuinely might not have known specifics, but most must have known something terrible was happening. Justice versus vengeance. American soldiers and commanders struggled with the line between justice and vengeance. Immediate executions of SS guards represented vengeance, understandable but technically illegal. War crimes trials represented justice, legal, documented, but slower, and potentially allowing guilty parties to escape. Allowing liberated prisoners to attack their tormentors represented both. Survivors getting immediate satisfaction. But were they meting out justice or vengeance? There was no clear answer. Different soldiers, different commanders, and different camps handled things differently. The overwhelming nature of the crimes, the rage they provoked, and the absence of clear precedent for such atrocities created moral and legal chaos. Colonel Robert Allen, legal officer with the Third Army, later reflected, "We had rules of war, Geneva Conventions, military justice, but nothing prepared us for what to do when we discovered industrialized genocide. Do you arrest everyone involved and try them? That could be thousands of people. Do you execute the worst offenders immediately? That's not legal, but it's what soldiers wanted to do. Do you let survivors have revenge? We couldn't resolve these questions in the chaos of April 1945. We did our best, but I'm not sure we got it right." Beyond the overwhelming statistics and horrific scenes, the liberation of concentration camps produced individual human stories that illuminate the experience. Survivor stories. Elie Wiesel at Buchenwald. Elie Wiesel, who would later win the Nobel Peace Prize for his Holocaust memoir, Night, was 16 years old when American forces liberated Buchenwald on April 11, 1945. He later wrote about liberation. "Our first act as free men was to throw ourselves onto the provisions. We thought only of that, not of revenge, not of our families. Nothing but bread. And even when we were no longer hungry, there was still no one who thought of revenge." On the following day, several of the young men ran to Weimar to get some potatoes and clothes and to sleep with girls. But of revenge, not a sign. Wiesel's account illustrates the physical desperation of survivors. Even after liberation, the body's needs overwhelmed everything else. Revenge, justice, even reunion with family, all were secondary to the basic needs of food and rest. Years later, Wiesel reflected on the American soldiers who liberated him. "They looked at us with disbelief. They couldn't process what they were seeing. I saw one soldier cry. I saw another get angry and start shouting in English. I didn't understand the words, but I understood the rage. These men had saved us, but I'm not sure they understood what they'd saved us from." The children of Buchenwald. When Buchenwald was liberated, over 900 children were found in the camp, some as young as 4 years old. These children had survived through a combination of luck, the protection of adult prisoners who'd hidden them, and their own resilience. The American soldiers were particularly affected by the children. Grown men, hardened by combat, found themselves overcome by emotion seeing starving children. One of these children was Israel Meir Lau, who was 8 years old at liberation. He later became chief rabbi of Israel. He recalled, "An American soldier lifted me up. I was so light he could hold me with one arm. He was crying. He kept saying words I didn't understand. I later learned he was saying, 'It's okay, you're safe now.' He gave me chocolate. I'd forgotten chocolate existed. That American soldier's face is the first kind face I can remember seeing." Miraculous reunions. Some liberation stories involved miraculous reunions. Families that had been separated, assuming each member had died, occasionally found each other in the chaos after liberation. One documented case involves Joseph and Rebecca Bau, Czech Jews who'd been separated when Rebecca was sent to Auschwitz and Joseph to a labor camp. Both survived. After liberation, through a series of coincidences and months of searching, they found each other in a displaced persons camp in Germany in late 1945. They married shortly after. Joseph later said, "When I saw her again, I couldn't believe it was real. We'd both assumed the other had died. Finding her alive was like being given life again. Liberation gave us freedom, but finding each other gave us a reason to use that freedom." The grateful and the traumatized. Survivors' reactions to liberation varied enormously. Some were overwhelmingly grateful. treating their liberators as heroes and saviors. They expressed joy, relief, and hope for the future. Others were so traumatized they couldn't process liberation. They remained in psychological states of imprisonment, unable to believe they were truly free or that the nightmare was over. Still others felt survivors' guilt. Why had they lived when so many had died? Liberation brought freedom, but also the crushing weight of loss. Captain Abraham Karliko, a Jewish-American chaplain with the U.S. Army, worked with survivors after liberation. He observed, some survivors immediately began talking about the future, where they'd go, how they'd rebuild lives. Others couldn't think beyond the next hour. Some asked about family members, hoping for news. When I had to tell them their families were gone, some collapsed. Liberation was the beginning of freedom, but also the beginning of grief. Liberator stories. Leon Bass, the African-American liberator. Leon Bass was an African-American soldier with the 183rd Engineer Combat Battalion. When his unit helped liberate Buchenwald, Bass experienced complex emotions as a black man in a segregated U.S. Army, witnessing the results of Nazi racial ideology. Bass later became an educator, speaking about the Holocaust and drawing connections between different forms of racism and prejudice. He often described the irony of fighting to free others while serving in a segregated military. "I saw what racism taken to its extreme could do," Bass said. "As a black man in America, I knew prejudice. But seeing what the Nazis did, that was racism as genocide. It connected for me. All forms of hatred and prejudice are dangerous. They all lead to suffering. I came back from the war determined to fight prejudice in America, just as I'd fought it in Germany. The medics who couldn't save everyone, military doctors and medics faced perhaps the most agonizing experiences after liberation. They had the skills to help, but faced numbers that overwhelmed their capabilities." Captain Maxwell Simmons, a doctor with the 89th Division, kept a diary of his experience at Ohrdruf and later Buchenwald. Entries describe the frustration of trying to save patients who were too far gone, the grief of watching people die despite treatment, and the emotional toll of being surrounded by suffering. One entry from April 13, 1945. "I treated 60 patients today. 5 died despite my efforts. Their bodies were too damaged. I saved some, but not enough. Never enough. How do you choose who gets treatment when everyone is dying? How do you tell a man you can't help him because someone else has a better chance of survival? I became a doctor to save lives. Here, all I do is watch people die. The soldier who couldn't eat. Multiple soldiers reported being unable to eat after witnessing the camps. Seeing starving people made eating feel wrong, guilty, obscene." Private David Walsh of the 42nd Division at Dachau later recalled, "After we went through that camp, I couldn't eat for 3 days. The guys kept trying to give me rations, but I'd look at food and think about those starving people and I'd feel sick. How could I eat when they were starving? It felt wrong. Finally, a sergeant sat me down and said, 'You not eating doesn't feed them. You need to stay strong to help them.' He was right, but it took me weeks before eating didn't feel like a betrayal." The chaplains. Military chaplains of all faiths played crucial roles after liberation, providing spiritual comfort to both survivors and liberating soldiers. Rabbi Herschel Schachter entered Buchenwald with American forces. He later described finding a young boy, Yisrael Meyer Lau, mentioned earlier, and other children, and trying to comfort them. Many survivors wanted religious services, having been denied them during captivity. Father Edward Doyle, a Catholic chaplain, described conducting burial services for thousands. "We buried so many people. I said prayers over mass graves. I tried to give dignity to the dead. But how do you provide spiritual comfort in the face of such evil? I questioned my faith. I questioned God. How could God allow this?" I don't have answers. I just did my duty and tried to help. The photographers. Military photographers had the grim duty of documenting the camps. They took thousands of photographs that would become iconic images of the Holocaust. Private H. Miller of the Army Signal Corps, who photographed Dachau, later said, "I took pictures because I was ordered to, but it felt wrong, like I was exploiting their suffering. These were people, not subjects for photographs. But I also understood, if we didn't document this, people might not believe it happened. Every picture I took, I knew it needed to tell the truth. I needed to show how bad it really was." The liberation of concentration camps had profound long-term consequences for the survivors, the liberators, and the world's understanding of the Holocaust. For survivors. Displaced persons. Most survivors couldn't return home. Their homes had been destroyed, occupied by others, or were in countries where they'd face anti-Semitism or danger. They became displaced persons, DPs. DP camps were established across Germany, Austria, and other parts of Europe. These camps housed hundreds of thousands of Holocaust survivors, refugees, and others displaced by the war. Conditions in DP camps varied widely. Some were reasonably comfortable, others were barely better than the concentration camps they'd left. Survivors lived in DP camps for months or years, waiting for countries to accept them for resettlement. The process was slow and frustrating. Many countries had restrictive immigration policies, especially regarding Jewish refugees. Physical recovery. Many survivors never fully recovered physically. Years of starvation, disease, and abuse left permanent damage. Health problems persisted for decades. Some survivors were able to regain weight and strength. Others suffered chronic health issues for the rest of their lives. Medical science in 1945 had limited understanding of how to treat the long-term effects of extreme starvation and trauma. Psychological recovery. The psychological impact of concentration camps was even more profound and longer-lasting than physical damage. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, wasn't recognized as a diagnosis until decades later, but survivors clearly suffered from it. Nightmares, flashbacks, anxiety, depression, and difficulty forming attachments were common. Many survivors were reluctant to discuss their experiences. Some remained silent for decades, unable or unwilling to speak about what they'd endured. Others felt compelled to testify, to ensure the world knew what had happened. Survivors' guilt was pervasive. Why had they lived when so many died? Many struggled with this question for the rest of their lives. Rebuilding lives. Despite trauma, many survivors rebuilt remarkable lives. They emigrated to new countries, United States, Israel, South America, and elsewhere, learned new languages, started families, and created new communities. This resilience is one of the remarkable aspects of the Holocaust story. People who'd experienced unimaginable horror found ways to live again, to love again, to hope again. But the trauma never fully left. Survivors carried their experiences with them. Many raised children who inherited secondary trauma, the psychological weight of parents' experiences. Testimony and memory. Many survivors eventually chose to testify about their experiences. Organizations like the Shoah Foundation collected thousands of testimonies. Survivors spoke at schools, wrote memoirs, and participated in Holocaust education. This testimony served multiple purposes: ensuring the Holocaust would be remembered, educating new generations, countering Holocaust denial, and providing survivors with some sense of meaning in their survival. For liberators, immediate psychological impact. Soldiers who liberated concentration camps often suffered immediate psychological trauma. Many exhibited symptoms of what we'd now call PTSD, nightmares, intrusive memories, anxiety, and difficulty readjusting to normal life. In 1945, mental health support for traumatized soldiers was limited. Shell shock from combat was recognized, but the specific trauma of witnessing genocide was poorly understood. Many soldiers were expected to simply get over it and move on. Long-term effects. For many liberators, the camp experience remained the defining moment of their lives. Decades later, veterans would say that witnessing the camps affected them more profoundly than combat. Some liberators became active in Holocaust education, speaking at schools and museums about what they'd witnessed. They felt a responsibility to ensure people understood what had happened. Others remained silent, unable to discuss their experiences. Some families didn't learn until years later that their father or grandfather had liberated a concentration camp. Many liberators struggled with the memory of what they'd seen. The images haunted them. Some developed depression, substance abuse issues, or other problems related to unprocessed trauma. Relationships and families. The camp experience affected liberators' relationships. Some became distant or emotionally withdrawn. Others became overprotective of their children, having seen what humans were capable of doing. Some veterans connected deeply with Holocaust survivors, forming friendships and advocacy partnerships. These relationships helped both groups process their shared connection to the camps. For the U.S. military and government, documentation and evidence. The extensive documentation of concentration camps provided crucial evidence for war crimes trials. Photographs, film footage, written reports, and survivor testimony were used at Nuremberg and subsequent trials. This documentation also educated the American public and the world about Nazi atrocities. Newsreels showed camp footage. Newspapers published photographs. Americans who'd been skeptical about reports of Nazi crimes were confronted with undeniable evidence. Policy changes. The discovery of concentration camps influenced U.S. marsh policy in several ways. Support for war crimes. Trials. The Nuremberg trials prosecuted Nazi leadership for crimes against humanity. The concentration camps provided much of the evidence. Displaced persons policy. The U.S. eventually accepted thousands of Holocaust survivors as refugees, though initial policies were restrictive. Support for Israel. American awareness of the Holocaust contributed to U.S. support for the establishment of Israel in 1948. Never Again doctrine. The Holocaust became a touchstone for discussions about genocide prevention and international humanitarian intervention. For world understanding of the Holocaust, photographic evidence, the photographs and films from liberated camps became some of the most powerful visual evidence of the Holocaust. These images shocked the world and made denying Nazi crimes nearly impossible. Images of piled corpses, emaciated survivors, and camp infrastructure became seared into public consciousness. They remain iconic representations of Holocaust horror. Testimony. Liberators' testimony, combined with survivors' accounts, provided detailed documentation of Nazi crimes. This testimony was crucial for historical understanding and for combating Holocaust denial. Educational impact. The liberation of camps became a crucial part of Holocaust education. The story of American soldiers discovering the camps is taught in schools worldwide. It provides an entry point for Americans to connect with Holocaust history. For memory and commemoration, many liberated camps became memorials and museums. Dachau Concentration Camp Memorial, Buchenwald Memorial, Mauthausen Memorial. These sites preserve memory, educate visitors, and honor victims. They also commemorate the liberation by Allied forces. Lessons and legacy. The liberation of concentration camps taught several crucial lessons. 1. The reality of industrial genocide. The camps proved that systematic, industrial-scale genocide was possible. This shattered assumptions about human civilization and morality. 2. The importance of intervention. The liberation demonstrated the necessity of military intervention against genocidal regimes. Never again became a rallying cry for preventing future genocides. 3. The need for documentation. Eisenhower's insistence on thorough documentation proved prescient. The evidence gathered in 1945 has been crucial for historical memory and combating denial. 4. The trauma of bearing. Witness. The psychological impact on liberators demonstrated that even witnessing atrocity causes trauma. This influenced later understanding of secondary trauma and the psychological cost of humanitarian work. 5. The resilience of survivors. Despite unimaginable suffering, many survivors rebuilt lives, started families, and contributed to society. This resilience is itself a form of resistance to Nazi aims. As we reach the end of this documentary, we return to where we began. American soldiers encountering concentration camps in April and May 1945. What the liberators understood, in those first moments, days and weeks, American soldiers understood several things with absolute clarity. They'd witnessed absolute evil. Whatever ambiguities might exist in warfare, whatever gray areas might exist in moral questions, the concentration camps represented evil that was clear and undeniable. Systematic murder, industrial-scale cruelty, deliberate torture, and starvation. This was evil without qualification. They'd seen the reason for the war. Some soldiers had questioned why they were fighting, whether the war was worth the cost. The camps answered that question definitively. They were fighting to stop this. The war was not only justified, but necessary. They'd carry this forever. Even in April 1945, soldiers knew they'd never forget what they'd seen. The images would stay with them for life. Some welcomed this, feeling obligated to bear witness. Others dreaded it, knowing they'd been permanently marked by the experience. They had to tell the world. Almost universally, liberators felt compelled to ensure people knew what had happened. This drove documentation efforts and later testimony. They understood that people who hadn't seen it might not believe it or might minimize it. What survivors understood. For survivors, liberation brought complex realizations. Freedom was real but fragile. After years in camps, some survivors couldn't quite believe they were free. It took time for the psychological reality of freedom to match the physical reality. Loss was permanent. Liberation meant survival, but it also meant confronting loss. Families were gone. Communities were destroyed. Homes were ruins. Freedom brought grief as well as relief. Life could continue. Despite everything, life could continue. This realization came at different times for different survivors. Some embraced it immediately. Others took years or decades. But eventually, most survivors found ways to live again. Memory was responsibility. Many survivors came to feel that their survival carried responsibility. To remember, to testify, to educate. Their survival had meaning if they could help prevent such atrocities from happening again. The historical significance. The liberation of concentration camps represents several historically significant moments. First, comprehensive documentation of genocide. While genocide had occurred before, the Holocaust was the first genocide to be thoroughly documented as it was discovered. The photographs, films, and reports from liberation created an unprecedented historical record. Awakening of global consciousness. The liberation shocked the world and contributed to development of international human rights law, genocide prevention efforts, and the concept of crimes against humanity. Foundation for memory culture. The liberation established patterns for how genocide would be remembered through museums, memorials, testimony, and education. These patterns have been applied to subsequent genocides. Personal transformation. For both survivors and liberators, The camps were transformative experiences. They shaped identities, values, and life trajectories in profound ways. The human dimension. Beyond historical significance, the liberation was profoundly human. It was soldiers who expected to find a prison camp, finding instead evidence of systematic murder on an unimaginable scale. It was medical personnel trying desperately to save people whose bodies had been too damaged to repair. It was survivors seeing kindness for the first time in years and struggling to trust it. It was moments of grace, a soldier sharing chocolate with a starving child, a medic holding the hand of a dying prisoner, survivors embracing each other and their liberators. It was moments of rage, soldiers executing SS guards, survivors attacking capos, the desire for immediate vengeance against perpetrators. It was complexity, liberators traumatized by what they witnessed, survivors grateful but also grieving, Germans confronting evidence of crimes done in their name. The legacy for today. 80 years after the liberation of concentration camps, what does this history mean for us today? 1. Genocide remains possible. The Holocaust proved that industrial genocide could happen in a civilized, educated, technologically advanced society. This possibility hasn't disappeared. Genocides have occurred since 1945. Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur. The lesson of never again requires constant vigilance. 2. Ordinary people face extraordinary choices. The soldiers who liberated camps were ordinary Americans thrust into extraordinary circumstances. Their responses, compassion, rage, trauma, determination to document, show how ordinary people respond to confronting absolute evil. We are all potentially in such situations. 3. Memory requires active maintenance. As survivors and liberators die, the last survivors are now in their 90s or older. Maintaining memory becomes more challenging. This makes testimony, documentation, and education crucial. Memory doesn't maintain itself. It requires active effort. 4. Trauma has generational effects. The trauma of the Holocaust affected not just survivors and liberators, but their children and grandchildren. Understanding intergenerational trauma helps us support affected communities and understand long-term consequences of atrocity. 5. Bearing witness is important but costly. Liberators bore witness to genocide, and it cost them psychologically. This reminds us that bearing witness to atrocity, whether as a soldier, journalist, humanitarian worker, or activist, involves real psychological costs that must be acknowledged and supported. Honoring the liberators. The American soldiers who liberated concentration camps deserve recognition not just as liberators, but as witnesses who carried a terrible burden so that the world would know what happened. They saw what most humans never see and should never have to see. They responded with compassion despite horror, with determination to help despite overwhelming need, and with commitment to documentation despite trauma. Many of these men never sought recognition. They felt they'd simply done their duty. But their duty included confronting evil, providing aid, bearing witness, and carrying memory. As these veterans have aged and died, we've lost first-hand witnesses to liberation. Soon, all will be gone. This makes their testimony, recorded in interviews, memoirs, and documentation, even more precious. Honoring the survivors. Survivors of concentration camps demonstrated remarkable resilience. Despite experiencing the worst humanity can inflict, many rebuilt lives, raised families, and contributed to their communities. Survivors became educators, ensuring future generations would know what happened. They became advocates for human rights, genocide prevention, and social justice. They transformed their trauma into meaning. Not all survivors could do this. Trauma was too great, losses too profound, but many did, and their resilience is itself a victory over Nazi aims. The final lesson: the liberation of concentration camps teaches us that evil, even when it seems overwhelming, is not permanent. It can be defeated, it can be stopped. But stopping evil requires people willing to fight it, willing to bear witness to it, willing to help its victims, and willing to ensure it's remembered and never repeated. The American soldiers who liberated concentration camps in April and May 1945 did all of these things. They fought the evil of Nazism. They witnessed its ultimate expression in the death camps. They helped its victims survive, and they documented what they found so it would never be forgotten. Their story of confronting the unthinkable, responding with humanity despite horror, and carrying the burden of memory remains relevant today. It reminds us that ordinary people can face extraordinary evil and respond with courage and compassion. We close with the words of Dwight D. Eisenhower, written shortly after he visited Ohrdruf. "The things I saw beggar description. The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were so overpowering as to leave me a bit sick." In one room, where they, 6, were piled up 20 or 30 naked men, killed by starvation, George Patton would not even enter. He said he would get sick if he did so. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give first-hand evidence of these things, if ever, in the future. There develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda. Eisenhower understood in April 1945 what remains true today. The truth of the Holocaust is so extreme that it requires witness, documentation, and constant retelling. Without this, people might not believe it happened. The American soldiers who liberated concentration camps became those witnesses. They saw the unspeakable. They documented it. They testified to it. And they carried it with them for the rest of their lives. We honor them by remembering what they found, by learning from what they witnessed, and by committing ourselves to ensuring such atrocities never happen again. This is what happened when American soldiers discovered the concentration camps. This is their story, and it is a story that must never be forgotten.